Este papel está una reflexión de la historia de mi teoría de argumentación multimodal. Y es 15 años más o menos después de la publicación de los primeros papeles. Esta es una revista. My essay, Multi-Modal Argumentation, was published in the journal Philosophy of the Social Sciences in 1994. This information appeared again in my book, Coalescent Argumentation, in 97. In the ensuing 16 years, there have been many changes to argumentation theory, and I would like to take this opportunity to continue to review my now teenage theory in light of the development in our discipline. I will begin by reminding you of the essential aspects of my theory and make some general comments. The theory of multimodal argumentation holds that communication in general and argument in particular never occurs in one single mode. By a mode, I mean, fuzzily, a means or way of communicating, a form of expression or a style of imparting information. Modes, then, are systems of messaging using culturally dependent signs, signals, and methods intended to pass information from one subject to another. I never suggested that messages were exclusively in one mode or another, but rather that they were mixed and could be examined separately, but were not found in the real world separately. Right? I never argued also for the correctness of these four modes. Someone might want 5 modes or 6 modes or 2 modes. I just selected 4. The 4 modes I did identify were the logical, the emotional, the visceral, and the visceral. The logical mode appears in virtually every argument in one way or another. It is the mode that assists us in moving from a message to a conclusion in a reasoned and patterned way. Some arguments are more logically derived than others, especially those that, for example, what Perelman called the quasi-logical, that have una forma que es consistente con la lógica. The second mode is the emotional mode, and here I have written that the key to is that the emotion being expressed in or by an argument are more important than the words being used for that expression. Significa que cuando alguien dice algo en un modo emocional, las emociones están que está importante, y no las palabras. Thus, we often disregard the words someone utters because we are confident that the message is expressed in the emotional package in which the words are located. The third mode is the visceral, and covers all aspects of a message or an argument that are physical or environmental. Here, the idea of an environment is being used very widely. It includes political and social aspects of the context as well as power relations. Visceral events can themselves be premises in an argument, and I have used a double square bracket to indicate it. So, significa que un evento actual puede estar una premisa en una argumentación, como un juego de fútbol, o alguien hace un mano abajo. So, this is important because an action can change the significance of the words in a message, and therefore is part of the message. The final mode I identified involves the area of communication that is intuitive, mystical, religious, or revelatory. I call this mode the visceral, from the Japanese word ki, meaning energy. This is a mode that is often disdained by rationalists, though they have difficulty dismissing it due to its widespread use. It's fairly clear, for example, that more of the human population believes in the existence of invisible entities such as ghosts and deities and spirits than do not. So it's hard to ignore this. My reasons for introducing the complication of multimodalities into argumentation theory has to do with my respect for the very importance of argumentation theory. I believe that argumentation is a vital discipline that can be used to understand and hone the tools people draw on to communicate with each other, embrace agreement, and avoid violence. In order to do this, it seems to me that we need to combine those sorts of arguments that we need to examine the sorts of arguments that ordinary arguers actually use. We cannot simply look at the argument forms we believe arguers ought use, but rather those which they do use. It is this belief that led me to make so much trouble about the forms of argument we study, and to insist that we must go to the arguer rather than have the arguer come to us. Descriptivity antes de prescriptivity. The issue, as I saw it, was that argumentation theory was focusing on the easy parts, the CRCs. CRC está no clama premisa complexo. That were analyzable and that could be broken into easily digested bits and be categorized and sorted without too much discussion. Yet our own lived experience of arguing with colleagues, friends, and family demonstrates that arguing is not a linear process with clearly defined edges and readily identifiable components. Las argumentaciones real con la familia, amigos, está muy diferente que los textos. Our lived experience entails, if anything, the exact opposite. Real, everyday marketplace argumentation is frequently chaotic, rambling, emotional, and rife with explicit and implicit references to and reliance on the context, the social milieu, personalities, and personal history of the argument and the arguers. This is the point made by Willard in 1989. He claimed that arguers use all the tools at their disposal to persuade a partner. Todos los herramientas que están allá usando por los argumentos. I took these ideas to the extreme. I have a great admiration for Willard. And I took his ideas to the extreme and included as parts of an argument the physical setting, mannerisms used, and a multitude of other factors not normally included in the analysis of an argument. I hope that now the purpose and importance of multimodal approach becomes clearer. Entienden por qué hago esto. In order to investigate the role that all these aspects and factors play in a complex communication, it is necessary to examine them using more than the tools logic and even informal logic make available. We need to analyze them according to their purpose, intended and actual, and their result, intended and actual. This demands a very wide breadth. And that is where the multimodal approach comes in. A multimodal analysis allows us to examine a situation from a variety of perspectives, not just one. The tools multimodal aside that currently exist are very valuable and important. The ability to diagram an argument, to investigate it for fallacies, apply a pragmadialectic analysis, are all vital tools for the argument analyst. Nonetheless, my sense that the richness of communication was being missed by not applying these tools within the various modes led me to believe that a great deal of importance that was occurring within arguments was being missed. And that we needed to use these tools in the modes. I want to emphasize several points that, while I have mentioned in my work, should be stressed. The first involves the difficulty of separating the modes, and more importantly, placing communication in specific modes. By this I mean to refer to the process of determining that some communication, action, message, or argument, say, is in the visceral rather than the emotional mode. The fact is that while there are paradigms of each mode, separability and its analog categorizability are never definite. Es siempre es más o menos lo mejor escoja. Consider, for example, a grimace. A grimace can be used to demonstrate disapproval, pain, discomfort, or other emotions. In itself, it is a visceral action, a physical movement of the lips and face. In context, it might indicate something emotional, as one grimaces at the thought of going to the dentist or taking an exam. We cannot know and need not know if a grimace is primarily a visceral or emotional object, except in the situations when we are actually analyzing the role one particular grimace token plays in a particular argumentative interaction. So a grimace, how do you say grimace? Mueca? Mueca, mueca, whatever it is. A grimace puede tener muchas significaciones. Y no es tan importante cuál categoría usamos por una instancia. Pero que es tan importante es en el contexto que significa el grimace como un mensaje. Okay. In this regard, it might have been better to have referred to the modes as aspects, as this might have emphasized the ability of an occurrence to play many roles and be viewed in many different ways. The modes do not indicate real different things, but rather ways of analyzing or dissecting things according to certain conceptions. A grimace that it occurs in a counter is simply what it is, a grimace. The phenomenological experience of a grimace provides us with cues that can be played out in different ways depending on the context and the balance of the message. We know from Wittgenstein and Grice, to name but two philosophers, that we cannot determine meaning outside of context. The phrase, "that's just great," can indicate joy or bedevilment, just like "perfecto es todo necesitamos ahora" can mean things are wonderful or things are terrible. Well, fortunately, you haven't had to say that. So the modes, rather than being tools for categorizing, are tools for understanding the meaning of a communication. Whenever we do philosophy, communication theory, or any sort of abstract analysis, we necessarily take things apart, break them down into bite-sized, analyzable bits. It is imperative, however, that we not mistake this analysis, these parts, for the reality. If, to use an analogy, we mix several colors together in a glass bowl, we end up with a new color. We know what colors we put in, but the result is still one color. And it is not possible to subsequently separate them out. The modes are like the colors. We know they are all in there, and we can discuss their impact on the whole, but we cannot separate them out. I would like to turn now to the various modes and talk about each one a little bit in particular. In light of what I've been thinking this past while. So, of course, the preeminent mode, la abuela, is the logical mode. In fact, some rationalists believe that all communication is really in the logical mode, and if it isn't apparently in the logical mode, then it's hidden underneath somehow. Right? So we translate, according to them, if you will, in lightning speed, so that it just seems that the reasoning is non-logical when in reality it really is. Okay? This is false. Fricker responds to this sort of approach when he's talking about intuition. Can we really imagine, he asks, that many things we do automatically, like hitting a tennis ball or recognizing a face, are really drawn-out affairs done quickly? So when I'm hitting a tennis ball, am I really figuring the velocity, the height, the spin, the length of my racket, how far it is? No. We don't calculate these things. It's a creative, intuitional process. That hardly makes sense. Damasio calls this the high reason view and argues that it simply can't work. All right. I don't want to spend a great deal of time talking about the non-logical modes and whether they exist. I'm going to take it for granted they exist. If you don't think they exist, then play a game. I concede we can always create a story about a non-logical mode that turns it into logic. But we can give a mechanistic interpretation of, say, love, like Chris does, and sacrifices one makes for it. But such explanations are inevitably unsatisfactory. They fail to explain why some people fall in love and others do not. They fail to explain altruism, why Jane might love Jack but not his twin brother Alan, and other lovely anomalies. Moreover, there is a difference, thank you. Moreover, there is a difference between the cause of something and the experience of it. Knowing that when I burn my hand, I am just exciting a bunch of nerves to a high level of activity does not make it hurt any less. Although there are aspects to that. I was very careful back when I first introduced the idea of modes to use the term logical for, rather than the term rational for what I call the logical mode, because the term logical is very imperialistic. Right? So the rationalists want to say, they say, well, I'm a rationalist, and what they mean is that everything good is rational and everything bad is not. So emotion is not rational, it's bad. Right? Intuition is not rational, it's bad. What I'm doing is I'm saying the only logical mode is the logical one. Yes, it's rational, but the others are rational as well. And part of our job is to understand that kind of rationality. There is a good case for saying that virtually every argument contains at least a minimal emotional component for the simple reason that one is moved from inertia to make an argument. The stimulus that moves one from inertia in some degree of emotional reaction. Okay? In other words, one cares enough to make an argument. This does not mean that every argument is at heart an emotional argument, just that it's involved. Okay? Even though the communication might be quite logical, an emotional argument may still be present provided the emotions expressed in the argument are more important than the words and signals used to express them. A simple example is when, as above, the grimace contradicts the statement. Someone grimacing and saying they are not in pain will not be believed, whereas someone smiling and not exhibiting stress will. I take this to be non-controversial, and I believe that anyone involved in any form of communication studies, argumentation or otherwise, would not have a problem with this. What is puzzling to me is given this obviousness, is that so little attention has been paid to arguments involving these forms by the major theories. I have provided specific maps for investigating emotional arguments in both informal logic and the pragma-dialectic theory, but neither has been moved to embrace these views and attempt to incorporate emotion into argument analysis. Moreover, these major theories have not embraced any alternative way of including the analysis of emotion in argument. I believe this demonstrates more than anything else that there still exists a strong prejudice within argumentation theory against emotion as an argument-forming apparatus. So I think a lot of the theories now are paying lip service to emotion and other aspects of argument, but they're not really incorporating it. They're not seeing just how dense the role of these non-logical aspects are in emotion. There have been a number of scholars who have been examining these things. I'm not going to list the names. Nonetheless, emotion is still an aside, as opposed to a factor that must be considered in all circumstances. One reason for this is the mistaken belief that discursive communication is considerably more precise and manageable than emotional communication. I call this the fallacia logocentric. But the prejudice is deeply rooted. Everyone who is married or has a boyfriend or girlfriend knows that the phrase, "do whatever you want, I don't care." It is the emotion and not the words that contain the message, the real message. So there is a reason for the avoidance of emotional messages, given the heart of the issue, fear of psychologism. As I use the term here, I refer to the ascription of a subject of a position, belief, or attitude based on non-discursive information communicated by the emotion present in a message. One deduces a position from the emotion. Such an ascription is a direct violation of the pragmadialectic Rule 3. An attack on a standpoint must relate to the standpoint that has really been advanced by the protagonist. So, assuming that an interlocutor has expressed an emotional statement which she has not explicitly uttered, it may violate this rule. On the other hand, the next rule, Rule 4, states, a person may be held to the premises he leaves implicit. So it is possible that one could play with this differentiation about implicit premises and use it to bring out more emotional arguments. Informal logic similarly has a prejudice against the unexpressed, except insofar as it might be seen to apply to virtually deductively entailed enthymematic expressions. If it doesn't come right out enthymematically, then it doesn't happen. This is not to say that emotional components are ruled out of court, but rather that they must be expressed quite explicitly in ways that emotions are rarely presented. Las emociones llevan por mensajes. Y la mayoría de los tiempos no están dichos directamente, except in la terapia. Informal logic, yes, okay. This is clearly demonstrated when arguments are diagrammed. There is simply no place to put the emotional interpretation of a message that may, in fact, straightforwardly contradicts its discursive statement. I'm going to skip. Okay. The visceral mode. The visceral mode covers a wide range of communicative factors that, like emotion, are often considered peripheral or irrelevant. Certainly, the visceral mode must include what is generally considered nonverbal communication, but also further areas that go beyond that category. To begin with, I want to place some nonverbal communications in the emotional category rather than the visceral, because their impact is more to do with emotions than with physicality. So the importance of it, okay? Secondly, there are visceral aspects of a communication which I believe to be important that would only be considered nonverbal communication at a stretch. These include power relations, argument style, social and cultural considerations such as class and gender, as well as other factors that influence an argument or can be used in an argument that would not traditionally be considered nonverbal communication. El aspecto de género, por ejemplo, está muy importante en las comunicaciones. Y aprendemos más y más cuánto importante estos están. The standard approaches place a huge emphasis on the discursive, often to the point where if something is not discursive, it is for all practical purposes ruled out of court. How, I wonder, can one remove the physical setting of an argument from the process of the argument? How can we ignore the role, for example, of uniforms, of a judge's robes, or even the male professor's ubiquitous tweed jacket? The traditionalist answers, but it is a fallacy to take those things into account when evaluating an argument. But they are part of the argument. We have to take them into account when we're analyzing the argument because they're there. That's like separating where you find a seashell from what it is. To mention but one area in which such visceral communications play an important role, there's gender. Adelsky and Tannen, for example, show that men take more speaking turns than women in mixed gender settings, and go as far as to suggest that the traditional yacky female is likely one who talks only as much as a man. Gender makes an enormous difference. Good. Authority and categorization, whether by race, gender, cultural, or any other means, plays an overweening role in the process of argumentation, and we ignore it at our peril. The dearth of women in philosophy, for example, is laid by some, including Rooney most recently, at the feet of the style of argumentation used in philosophy, and especially its reliance in the argument as war metaphor. What does it mean, then, to say that such factors are irrelevant to the analysis of an argument? It means that we are removing the argument from its context, examining it en abstracto, as a CRC, something that exists independent of its users, its hearers, its senders, or persons, and I believe there is no such thing. Having said that, let me give an appreciation to every model that is a tool in the argumentation theorist's toolbox. There is nothing wrong with taking a piece of argument and using it to demonstrate the kind of connectivity and relationships that occur in arguments. Right? Whether the process is one of informal logic, pragmadialectics, argument maps, computation, it's very valuable, so long as the analysis is not confused with the argument. What I am doing by including the visceral mode as a form that must be investigated is making room for all the factors mentioned above, as well as many others to be examined. Once we understand a mode, how it works and what its dynamics are, and how it can be used properly and improperly, then we might be able to create some valuable normative correlates that will be useful. So if we understand a mode and we see how people are actually using it, when they are talking with each other, it's then that we can try and define some limits and usages that are proper and improper. When we can distinguish, for example, between emotional blackmail and an emotional appeal. Or when we can distinguish between a natural setting of politeness relationships or an abuse of power. Recently, I've been thinking about the role of kisserl arguments, arguments from intuition or mysticism or all those strange things. That's the one that drives people the most crazy. Gilbert to kisserl. The kisserl mode includes argument forms and data that are involved with intuition, the mystical hunches, the religious, mysterious, and generally non-sensory forms of persuasion. As I regularly point out, more of the human population believes in the existence of invisible beings such as ghosts, gods, spirits, and so on than does not. Moreover, many of these people have communion with such entities and or insight into their nature or being. They talk to them. As puzzling as I find this, it is nonetheless the case, and even many highly educated people maintain such beliefs. One need only look at the scholarly journals that abound in theology and religious studies to see the truth of this. The difficulty with the kisserl mode is twofold. The first issue reflects the strong sense of certainty of surety that many people have concerning some nonsensory beliefs, while the second centers on the inability of such beliefs to be subject to falsification. These two problems are closely related and intertwined. Surety, certainty, is at the core of intuition insofar as it puts these beliefs and arguments apart from other, more empirical beliefs. In fact, we often feel more strongly and believe more fervently in a select number of our non-sensory beliefs than we do in our collection of facts. I believe with a great deal of certainty, for example, that if one were to write out an integer with as many places as hairs on the head of this audience, there would still be one higher. I can't prove this, yet I believe it with certainty. This is truly bizarre. Here I am, a highly rational person, holding firmly to an unfalsifiable belief that claims there exists an infinity of invisible objects. Numeros. It gets worse. Not only do I hold such beliefs, but I also hold that many others who hold different unfalsifiable beliefs with just as much evidence as I have and believe them just as fervently that they're wrong. My friend Kathy believes that everything that happens to you, everything that happens to anyone, happens because you want it to happen. You may not know that you want it to happen, but you must, because otherwise it wouldn't happen. This includes everything from winning the lottery to having cancer. The analyticity and circularity of her position does not faze her in the least, any more than the definitional quality that there is no highest integer bothers me. Yet it strikes me that she is wrong and is not justified in holding her belief, while I do have such justification. Here we might say, don't translate. Here we might say that my belief is fact, yours is theory, and hers is mysticism. This is like a Russellian declension. This translates somewhat less amusingly to mi opinión refleja los hechos, la tuya es mera teoría, la de ella es un caso de misticismo. In other words, I know what I'm talking about, but you don't. Nonetheless, both beliefs are unfalsifiable, and both are held with a great degree of certainty. Perhaps ours more than mine, but mine is pretty solid as well. I just happen to be a skeptic. When philosophers talk about caesural arguments, they typically worry about such things as axioms and foundational normative principles. One ultimate difficulty for those who like to dismiss intuitional arguments is that the grounds for doing so typically rely on intuition. One way of thinking about caesural arguments is to consider the discovery-justification distinction. We tell our introductory students that the process of discovery is different than the presentation of a justification. Yet in many caesural arguments, this is not the case. In those cases, the experience of discovery is just the same as justification. The mystic whose acolyte proceeds along certain specified steps may be following the only form of justification available. Just as the intuitionist mathematicians saw the process of proof creation, the actual construction of a mathematical object, the way in which one proves it, as essential to its justification. Are there facts we cannot comprehend if we do not have the experience? Can a male never understand a mother's love because he has never experienced pregnancy? Am I an atheist because I have never had a revelation or a mystical experience? In most cases, I reject these ideas for what I consider are good reasons. I believe, for example, that there is likely no major difference between the love of an adoptive mother compared to a biological one. And once exceptions begin to accrue, it's only a matter of time before we have lots of them. The problem is that my belief, even if supported by evidence from social psychology, ultimately rests on intuition as well. This means that the role of argumentation theory is to find means for separating and evaluating different beliefs according to criteria that can be accepted by partners and agreed upon as legitimate grounds for distinguishing between acceptable and unacceptable beliefs. This, of course, has both object level and meta level application. The object level may have identifiable rules and procedures, as Western philosophy does with logic, and it's less formal. We may be able to find rules for distinguishing certain sorts of caesareal arguments from others, and be able to say that there are ways that we know that one is more acceptable and one is less acceptable. But in order to do that, we have to go into the mode and understand it and how it is used. The problem is, my belief, even if supported by evidence, I'm sorry I said that, okay, forgive me. Okay. It will have been noticed in my presentation that I have not distinguished between arguments as objects and arguments as processes. I'm not paying attention to O'Keeffe's argument 1 and argument 2. I have avoided this distinction because, on the one hand, the multimodal framework cuts across them. There are multimodal arguments 1 and arguments 2 if one is going to use that distinction. And on the other, the distinction itself is not terribly useful aside from providing some paradigmatic exemplars. The real problem with argument 1 and argument 2 distinction lies in the complexity and necessity of context in understanding arguments. Por mí, el contexto de los argumentos está la cosa más importante. Mucho más importante que las palabras, porque no creo en frases, solo en mensajes. Y mensajes consisten en una paqueta de palabras, emociones, aspectos visceral y visceral, y esta es que necesitamos entender cuando invocan en un argumento. If that made sense. I never know. Moreover, right, the real problem, okay, the identification and isolation of a typical argument 1 requires that we understand enough of the context to be able to remove it and inspect it. And yet, unless we are examining something created for a critical thinking class, it is impossible to understand it in isolation from the context. So, as soon as we remove an argument from the context to make it an argument 1, we have already changed it. If we allow anything that influences an argument as part of it, which I do, I'm afraid, then the second part of it, and thereby the argument 2, is part of it. We end up with a sort of Heisenberg principle of argumentation. To remove a part of an argument from its context is thereby, ipso facto, to change it. This is not to say that we cannot study something in isolation, but rather that when we do so, we are missing a great deal of important information. I believe it is obvious that the notion of context is important, and many authors and theories pay lip service to this. Examples are often preceded by short paragraphs that describe the general background, for example, of a letter to the editor. So in a critical thinking textbook, you usually have a little paragraph before the example you have to analyze, and but this is nothing. This is bullshit. Compare this to the analysis that might accompany the discovery of an anthropological relic, where the surrounding area, adjacent soil, general location, historical knowledge of the area, flora and fauna will all be examined to learn more about the object. The anthropologist is going to look at everything and study, may study for the area for months before they actually dig it up to make sure that they're learning as much as they can. Context can demonstrate a great deal when we examine the arguments presented for it. Duran's analysis of the Chilean press takes enormous amounts of local, social, and historical information into account. Moreover, a rich account naturally examines the several modes as a means to understanding an object. If our archaeological find was a tool, was it decorated? Did it appear cared for? Did it seem to be important to the owner? Was it part of a set? There are emotional questions. Was it made from local material? I'm sorry, those are emotional questions. Was it made from local materials? What tools we used to make this tool? Did it have a spiritual aspect? Were there symbols of gods or demons on it? These are kisral aspects. Just with other such endeavors, understanding argument requires a knowledge of the context and the way in which the message was communicated, intended, and used. This, in turn, can be ably assisted by a multimodal analysis. I have, in the proceeding, tried to present both the amplification and defense of multimodal argumentation. I believe, as do some others, that it can be a useful and powerful tool for investigating the structure, meaning, and reliability of arguments. We must never forget, in examining models that make theorizing possible, that the models are but mere shadows of the reality. Thank you. Thank you. And before I forget, I would like to thank Chrissy for the wonderful Spanish translation of my slides. I did not do that.